Hi, I'm Mark, and today, once again, of course, this week, we need to talk about Brexit, as so often, because the British Conservative Party continues to argue about Brexit. However, the vote on the so-called Stormont break shows that the hardliners are becoming weaker. But the two British ex-Prime Ministers, Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, have announced their no to the agreement with the EU on the new implementation rules for Northern Ireland. The proposed agreements would either mean that Northern Ireland remains trapped by the EU legal order and increasingly diverges from the rest of the UK, is what Johnson told the Telegraph newspaper on Wednesday, or the entire United Kingdom could not benefit from Brexit. And this is unacceptable, said the former Conservative leader. The PA news agency reported from those close to Johnson's immediate successor that Truss would also vote against the agreement in the House of Commons on Wednesday. And this was justified by the fact that the new regulation would have an almost fatal effect on Britain's ability to deviate from EU regulations. In the afternoon, the House of Commons decided on the agreement, which only came about after years of debate and Johnson signing a much worse deal. With their no, both Johnson and Truss are opposing Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, who had also inherited them as party leader. The new agreement aims to make trade between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK easier. The Northern Ireland Protocol, originally negotiated as part of Brexit, provides for a customs border in the Irish Sea. This is intended to prevent border checks between Northern Ireland and EU member Ireland in order to prevent the old conflicts from flaring up again in the Civil War region. But the regulation brought with it some difficulties, for example, when sending parcels or taking pets with you. Johnson signed the internationally binding Northern Ireland Protocol himself, but soon criticized the agreement. In addition to him, other Conservative MPs wanted to vote against the new agreement that Sunak negotiated with EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen in the end. The government expected about 20 dissenters from its own ranks before the vote. We come to that later in the result. The dispute over Brexit and the Northern Ireland Protocol continued to divide the Conservative Party in Britain. As successful as Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has been in his tenure to date, the UK's relationship with the EU has been and remains an ongoing bone of contention within his party. That became clear again on Wednesday when the House of Commons voted on part of the new Windsor framework agreed with the EU. In order for former Prime Minister Boris Johnson to be able to take part in the vote, even as questioning about the controversial lockdown parties in front of the parliamentary committee was interrupted. Sunak voted on the so-called Stormont break on Wednesday, after only 90 minutes for a debate. And this is a construct that allows the Northern Ireland Parliament to object to EU law that still applies in Northern Ireland over trade in goods in case of changes. Brexit hardliners and the Northern Irish parties had spoken out against the agreement with the EU. And the result of the vote was, while the Labour opposition voted with the government, 100 MPs abstained, including 48 Conservatives. 22 Tory MPs opposed the deal with Brussels, as did 6 MPs from Northern Ireland's DUP. However, the result was clearly in favour of the government, with 515 votes to 29. Sunak won, but his opponents continue to make headlines, and above all, Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, as I said. They are both former prime ministers who resent Sunak's new diplomatic course with the EU. And they would obviously like to be back at the helm themselves. With the vote, the UK will implement the Stormont break of the Windsor Agreement. The 27 EU member states approved the agreement with London on Tuesday. It will be signed by both sides on Friday. However, the leader of the DUP parliamentary group in the House of Commons, Geoffrey Donaldson, continued to reject the idea of forming a government in Belfast. The DUP has been blocking Stormont for over a year, partly because the Unionists are only the second strongest party after Sinn Féin following their recent election victory. The Northern Ireland Protocol is put forward as an argument. And Donaldson said on Wednesday, I do not accept that our producers in Northern Ireland have to comply with EU law even if they don't sell a pin to the EU. That is wrong and undermines our position in the internal single market with the UK. He sees no basis for returning to Stormont to form a government. Political observers believe that this could change after the Northern Ireland elections in May, when the DUP no longer has to fear competition from the even tougher unionist party, the traditional unionist voice, the TUV. The Stormont break was specially negotiated to meet one of the maximum demands of the Northern Ireland Unionist Party, the DUP. Those don't understand politics. Among other things, the DUP had criticized the fact that after Brexit, Northern Ireland was part of the EU internal market with regard to the movement of goods. The EU regulations that apply in Northern Ireland must therefore be followed by Northern Ireland without it having a say in the matter. That's what happens if you leave the deciding club. The Stormont break will allow 30 MPs in Stormont to sign a petition objecting to an EU rule in case of a change or a new one. Of course, for that to happen, the DUP would have to return to forming a government. No bipartisan consensus needs to be reached for the petition, though. So only 28 unionists and 2 independent MPs can sign the petition. Although Sunak vetoed the Stormont break publicly, said it's a veto, well, even if Northern Ireland MPs object, London will decide whether the government will follow the objection and suspend the EU rule within 4 weeks. It can only do so in rare and exceptional cases, and only after Northern Ireland MSPs have proven in writing that the EU rule would have a sustained negative impact on daily life in Northern Ireland. This then triggers negotiations in the Joint Committee of the EU and the UK. If those negotiations fail and London wants to insist on suspending the EU rule, Sunak said he would first seek a bipartisan vote in Northern Ireland's parliament. Only then would London ignore the EU regulation, which could lead to EU countermeasures. The legal advisors of the Brexit hardliners in the Conservative Party, the ERG, have criticized in a report that the Stormont break is therefore practically useless. In the report, their legal advisors state that the Windsor Agreement is not nearly as positive as Sunak portrayed it. Even the EU admits that. The maximum demand of the ERG and the DUP was that no EU law should apply in Northern Ireland, that the European Court of Justice should no longer play a role, and that no border formalities and checks should be carried out in trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. The ERG, which works closely with the DUP on the matter, has now criticized the fact that EU law still applies to the movement of goods in Northern Ireland, and that the European Court of Justice and the EU Commission continue to play a role. EU law will continue to apply to the entire kingdom once British state aid has an impact on Northern Ireland. Since the Stormont break only applies in exceptional cases, it cannot be prevented that Northern Ireland will deviate from British regulations with its production under EU law in the long term. Extensive documentation is still necessary in trade across the Irish Sea, with appropriate checks. In essence, the Windsor framework cements the Northern Ireland Protocol rather than changing it. Former business secretary and ERG leader Jacob Rees-Mogg told right-wing TV broadcaster GB News, "The Windsor framework requires us to trust the EU. History shows that we cannot." And I'm always had to laugh at that one. He voted against the Stormont break, as did other Tory hardliners, including former Home Secretary Priti Patel. Nonetheless, the power of hardline Brexit supporters is dwindling. At 28 people, the revolt against Sunak was not nearly as strong as it was in the days of Prime Minister Theresa May, when the rebels had mustered 80 votes. The group, which had urged former Prime Minister David Cameron to call a Brexit referendum that undermined Theresa May until she resigned and pushed Boris Johnson for a hard Brexit, is divided. Some of its members are still fighting for the complete separation from the EU. Others have become more pragmatic and work with Sunak. Steve Baker, who set the ERG's tone in the fight against former Prime Minister May, turned against Johnson and Truss on Wednesday. I really expected them to think better of themselves, Baker said after the vote. Johnson has a choice. He could enjoy a long-term reputation as a statesman for everything he's done for the country. But he can also behave like a cheap seller like Nigel Farage, said Baker, with a dig at the British right-wing politician. Despite being a member of the ERG, Baker is on the side of Sunak. He is Secretary of State for Northern Ireland and promotes the Windsor Framework, along with the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Chris Heaton-Harris, also ERG, by the way. The agreement reached between the UK and the EU on the Brexit rules for Northern Ireland does, as I said, not find broad approval in the north of the Emerald Isle, because the most important unionist party, the DUP, which is also represented in the London House of Commons and voted against it, announced already on Monday that they would do so. And now we know that they did. The British House of Commons has voted in favor of this agreement between Great Britain and the EU, or the whole UK and the EU, in the Brexit dispute over Northern Ireland. The MPs voted on Wednesday with a clear majority, and this mechanism gives the Northern Irish Regional Parliament a say in the application of new EU rules in the north and changes to already existing rules. But Sunak was able to get the new agreement through Parliament without the DUP. However, the agreement then misses an important goal. The supporters of the union with Great Britain have been blocking the formation of the government in Northern Ireland for months in alleged protest against the previous regulations. I mentioned that earlier. And the Windsor Framework, sealed by Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen at the end of February, is intended to settle this years-long dispute over the Brexit rules for Northern Ireland. The fact that Sunak was able to prevail against opposition from his own Conservative Party and the Northern Irish Unionist Party DUP is considered an important success. His party friends and ex-heads of government Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, among others, had positioned themselves against him and couldn't bring many people with them. The existing agreement, the so-called Northern Ireland Protocol, of course had caused a controversy because it created a customs border between Great Britain and the rest and the north in the Irish Sea. But as I mentioned before, this was intended to keep the peace on the island. And what I heard in the House of Commons from the DUP about this destroying peace will only be destroyed if the DUP and their friends continue to act as they do against all reasons. And only because they feel a bit cut off from Britain. But yeah, the vote on Wednesday showed that the hardliners in the party are weakening and are no longer being listened to with their maximum demands. The party is tired of the argument and finally wants peace. And Sunak is trying to do just that, create calm. On Wednesday, Johnson made headlines again when he was questioned for 4 hours by the Parliament's Privileges Committee, trying to lie about his lies, or more simply, he tried to explain to the Parliamentary Committee why he lied to Parliament about the lockdown parties, but that he was not lying on purpose. The public and also Sunak have no nerve for this acrobatics. So Sunak is quite successful in ignoring the rebels and troublemakers. And Wednesday's vote showed that this could well be the way forward. And another point the DUP was ignoring is, as long as they block the formation of a government installment, the Stormont break does not come into force. And so whatever was decided on Wednesday, it will not matter until there is an assembly and an executive again in Northern Ireland. And so they don't... I sometimes don't even know what to say about the DUP anymore. They are to shoot yourself in your own foot is I don't know. They must use a machine gun for doing so. I really don't know. But we will talk about this much more. They only voted on the Stormont break on Wednesday, not on the full framework, in which no vote was necessary on that anyway. because the government has the right to do that without Parliament. And the whole opposition of Labour, SNP and Liberals all said they would vote with the government on that. And so Sunak was never in trouble getting the vote through. But it was interesting to see who voted how. But I'm quite sure we will talk about this a lot more, and we definitely will. And I'll see you in my next video. I'll be back.